Hi, my name is Shay. I'm an embroiderer and embroidery instructor, and today I'm going to be going over sort of everything that you need to know before you start stitching. So we're going to start off with what embroidery is, what some of the tools and the words used around embroidery are, and then we're going to finish off by explaining how to set up your hoop. I'm going to put timestamps down in the description so you can skip through to find what you're looking for if you don't want to watch the whole thing. So embroidery is sometimes an umbrella term used to cover a lot of different needle crafts. So that can include things like cross stitch, needlepoint, sashiko, and what we are going to be talking about and what most people think embroidery is hand embroidery. So that is something that looks kind of like this or like this, and involves embroidering using a certain set of stitches, usually on a hoop, and has recently sort of experienced a resurgence with a lot of women especially reclaiming the craft and making some really cool stuff. So we are going to move on now to the terms around embroidery. The first ones that we're going to talk about are materials that you're going to be using when you're embroidering. So the first one is a hoop. So a hoop is what you stretch your fabric across when you're stitching. There are different types of hoops. The most common are these plastic ones, or these wooden, typically bamboo ones. These are a bit more popular. They are just a bit prettier to finish your piece on, whereas these are good for if you're going to be taking it off the hoop at the end, and are a bit more durable. There are also metal hoops like this. This one is a metal spring on this end, and so it tightens itself. It is less common to have these kinds of hoops though, for a couple of reasons. One being, as you can see on this one, they can rust and leave marks on fabric, which I've had happen with this particular hoop. Also, you can't really control the tension. If you prefer it looser or you prefer it tighter, this type of hoop doesn't give you that range the same way that a hoop like this or this would. When you are looking for a hoop, when people talk about them, they are discussed in diameter. So one of the most common diameters is a 6-inch hoop. This is a 6-inch, 15.2 centimeters, and is a good size for a project that isn't going to take a super long time, and is probably the most common. They can get very small. There are ones that people will put on necklaces, but those are pretty atypical. Typically in the store, you're going to see as small as this kind of size, which is a 3-inch, up to usually a 15-inch. I don't have one of those, but this one is a 10-inch. On the bamboo ones, you can't really see it, but on the plastic ones, they will have a number up here by their screw where you can see what their diameter is. So when you're embroidering, you're also going to need something to embroider on. Sometimes that'll be clothes, but most typically you're going to be embroidering on fabric that is just loose. So there are different types of fabrics that are common for embroidering on. The most common is probably regular cotton. This is a fabric that isn't super stretchy. It's quite light, relatively inexpensive, and comes in a lot of different colors. When you are choosing a fabric, you typically don't want something that is too see-through, because then you'll see all your mistakes on the back. And you also want something that is not too thick. So if you're going to be embroidering on denim, that's going to be a lot harder than on something like flannel, which is another common one. Some here, because it is not super see-through. It's quite soft. It also comes in a lot of colors and isn't stretchy. You can embroider on stretchy fabric. It is just not the easiest. I've done it. It just is a lot harder to pull tight and to keep everything lined up correctly. Another type of cloth that you might see people talking about is called Aida cloth. And Aida cloth is a very thick, stiff fabric where you can see the threads that make it up. They are quite obvious. It is used most commonly in cross stitch because it creates a grid that you can follow, though many embroiderers also use it. It is not really for clothing or something that you would wear after you're done embroidering. It is more for display pieces. Okay, so another thing that we use in embroidery is embroidery floss. So embroidery floss is the word for this type of thread that you get when you're embroidering. You might have used it to make friendship bracelets when you were younger. It is pretty thick, but then if you look up close at it, it can be split into 6 individual threads. And so when we're embroidering, we typically will take a certain number of those threads. If you're using a pattern, it will tell you how many threads to use, and that is going to determine your line thickness when you're embroidering. So if you do 6 strands on your needle, then it's going to be quite a thick line as opposed to 1 where it's very thin. The most common amount of threads is either 2 or 3 because it divides into 6 well, so you're not going to have an extra thread floating around at the end. And they just usually have a pretty good thickness for what people want. There are different types of embroidery floss. There is the most typical one, which is floss. There are also ones like pearl cotton. So just make sure that you are getting the kind that has 6 strands, unless a pattern that you are using specifies otherwise. So another thing to talk about with floss is that it is often wound around something called a bobbin. That is this white shape here. I have an empty one. It looks like this. They are much easier to manage than the loop that you get when you buy your floss the first time. They are much easier to manage once you've wound them around a bobbin. So I would recommend investing in that. You can typically get like 50 of them for $1 or $2 at your craft store. So another thing that we usually use in embroidery is needles. There are different types of needles. You might see embroidery needles or tapestry needles. And what that is going to determine is how long the needle itself is, as well as how big the hole or the eye of the needle is at the end. You want something that is not too thick, that's not going to leave holes in your fabric, but also isn't too small so you can fit enough strands of your embroidery floss through it. Typically embroidery needles and tapestry needles are my favorite go-tos. I like ones that are probably a shorter length but a bigger eye, as long as the eye doesn't impact how thick the needle is. But ultimately that's the kind of thing that you're going to test different types of needles and see what works best for you. Just be careful that I wouldn't recommend a typical hand sewing needle. Like if you are used to sewing clothing, that type of needle has a very small eye and is really hard to get threads through. So we've talked about hoops, fabric, needles, thread, and all those along with scissors is all that you really need to get started with embroidery. But there are some other tools that are relatively inexpensive that will make your workflow quite a bit easier. So if you have an extra couple dollars, I'd absolutely recommend them. The first is my favorite, which is a threader. I have one here that has 3 different sizes of threader. I would recommend the type of threader that looks like this. It is a metal hook, looks almost like a crochet hook, and it's all one piece of metal. There are threaders that are used for hand sewing that have this sort of diamond wire shape, and those are typically more fragile and will often break when you try and pull the floss through the eye of the needle, and that can get really frustrating really fast. So I would recommend getting one that has this type of end on it. I will show you how to use it here. You put it through the eye of the needle, then you're going to loop your floss over the hook of the threader, and then hold the needle and pull it back through. And now you have your needle threaded. Super easy. In my opinion and experience, it is much easier than trying to jam all of your threads of floss through the needle yourself. Another very helpful tool is something that you can mark your fabric with. So whether you're following a pattern or you are creating your own pattern, this is something that will be helpful for you. Typically with patterns that you've bought, you're going to be transferring them yourself, whereas with your own pattern, you're going to be drawing it on. There are different types. So there are ones like this that will erase once you've let them sort of sit in the air. They're called air erase. Within 12 hours, the ink is gone. So that's good for if you're going to be doing something within that span of time, whereas if you're doing a project over a few days, it's going to disappear by then. So you might want to consider another option. Like this is a water erase. You just run it under some water and the ink will disappear. And then these are heat erase. So you just hit it with your hairdryer and they'll disappear. They can reappear if it gets really cold, so just keep that in mind, and definitely test on your fabric first before you go ahead with your pattern drawing. The last term I want to talk about is something called tension. So tension, not a tool, but something that you're going to be hearing a lot when you talk about different types of stitches. So tension is how tight you're pulling your thread and keeping your thread pulled. So something with very tight tension, you might be tugging on the fabric and gathering it as you're stitching, whereas something with really loose tension, you are going to have sort of almost bubbles or excess thread in your stitches. So you want to make sure that you are following the tension for whatever stitch it is you're doing. Typically you want a medium tension where it's laying flat and taut but not pulling. That is sort of what that means. You can also hear tension in reference to fabric on a hoop. You want your fabric to be taut or have a lot of tension in it. Typically that is what most embroiderers prefer, but that is something you can play around with as well. But when we're talking about tension, we're talking about how tight or loose something is. Okay, so to finish off, we are going to go over how to set up a hoop. So once you have your hoop, your cutout fabric, you want to cut out typically a square of fabric with at least a couple inches around where your hoop is lying. If you get it too close to the edge, then your fabric's just gonna fall out of your hoop, because as you're working on it, it's going to pull it a little bit. And every once in a while, you're gonna have to pull it back and tighten it as you're working. Okay, so once you have your fabric and your hoop, you are going to loosen the screw at the top of your hoop and take it apart. So you'll have the inside and the outside of the hoop ready to go. There are a couple of different ways to do this, but my preferred way is to put the inside of the hoop down and then take my fabric and lay it over top of the bottom of the hoop. It does not need to be taut at this point. We will tighten it once we have the top on. So once you've laid it over, you're going to take the outside of your hoop and push it on so that the fabric is sandwiched between the inside and outside of the hoop. Right now it's very loose though, so you're going to want to go back to that screw and tighten it up. I want to make it pretty much as tight as you can. Sometimes I will even use little mini pliers to crank it as tight as I can get it. That way you are going to be able to have a nice tension with your fabric on the hoop. So you want to pull around the edges of the hoop at the fabric like this until it is at a tautness that you like. Personally, I like to be drum taut, which is where you can hear when I hit it. I know some people who like it a little looser. I personally prefer it this way. It is something that you're going to figure out as you embroider yourself. So when you are putting your fabric on your hoop, something to consider is that if it is a non-stretchy fabric, which is what we typically want to be working in, it will have vertical and horizontal threads that if you get really close, you can see they make a grid. And you want to make sure that when you're pulling on your fabric that you're not distorting that grid. Because once you take your hoop off, the fabric wants to go back to its grid, and that's going to distort your embroidery. Another note is, if you care about this, you might want to look at your grid and make sure it lines up with your project when it's facing up. Sometimes if you get really close, you can notice that it's at a diagonal, and some people totally don't care, and that's perfectly fine. But I know some people who do care, and that is just something to be aware of, is that that is something that you can be considering when you are putting your fabric on your hoop. Okay, so once your fabric is on your hoop, you are ready to thread your needle and get embroidering. Very exciting. But this is where I'm going to leave you. So this is all the tips I have for beginner embroiderers. I wish you the best of luck with your embroidering. Let me know if you have any questions and I will try and answer them. Thanks for watching.